So before I begin, I'd just like to once again thank UCL-SSEES for awarding me this opportunity to carry out research in their archives, and for Jakob for very kindly agreeing to serve as host during the scholarship. So I should probably begin with that classic and much beloved academic practice of placing various limitations and caveats on myself. This project is still very much a work in progress, so there are still fairly sizable gaps in the research, specifically when it comes to the Czechoslovakian angle. I also won't really be arriving at any conclusions since I am still quite early in the research period, although I'm obviously happy to discuss or entertain any hypotheses those among you might have in the Q&A session. Just beginning then, so the study itself builds on a number of questions I explored in my recently published monograph. The link is there if you're interested, in which I'd almost describe R.W.Seton-Watson as a sort of informal protagonist. Indeed, although that's not strictly applicable for all of the titles you see listed here, it would certainly be difficult to argue that he doesn't loom large as an actor in the history of Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe after 1900. And if one was to just run through these various titles, it would soon become obvious just kind of how much influence he continues to exert. As for example, in the introduction to the one at the top here, Great Britain and Central Europe, Robert Evans, one of the editors, observes that nearly half of the volume's chapters, it's an edited volume rather than a single book, focus specifically on Seton-Watson, almost as this sort of vector for understanding how Britain's relations with specific ethnic groups or territories in this region were shaped and evolved. When you consider the often convoluted and multifaceted history of Britain's bilateral relations with the rest of the world, even those outside of the imperial sphere, the fact that one individual was able to not quite monopolize, but certainly dominate, shape, and to a certain degree create much of Britain's public and political discourse on these vast swathes of the European continent, it's nothing short of remarkable. That and the fact that he left one of the most comprehensive archives of correspondence and historical scholarship in the world, really, would certainly kind of speak to how much influence he continues to wield. Even today, maybe especially today, given the current geopolitical environment, I would contest that regardless of what you might feel about his historical worldview, and there is certainly plenty with which to disagree, he's almost represents something of a skeleton key for understanding how Britain's relations with Central Europe, particularly, evolved in the early 20th century. More significantly, you can still look to his efforts, even again after 1945 and argue about up to now, and his attempts to advance or develop these relations. And in order to understand why these kinds of movements and these kinds of efforts by particularly experts or certain political actors seem to invariably fail in the long term or even short term. Let's then begin with some context and a little bit of rationale for the project. On the 25th of July, 1951, the historian Robert William Seton-Watson died at his home on the Isle of Skye. A year later, the Slavonic and East European Review, which he had himself co-founded in 1922, published a selection of tributes praising his legacy as Britain's first recognised expert on the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Having first come to wider public attention, writing for The Spectator under the pseudonym Scotus Viator, or Scottish Traveller in Latin, in 1906, and his attributed role in the monarchy's supposed demise. Henry Wickensteed, former editor of The Times and a long-standing collaborator, lauded him as the pioneer who first broke the crust of British indifference towards European affairs by advocating for the Yugoslavian, and by extension Czechoslovak and Romanian, national causes. Having brought questions of purported political, economic and cultural injustice to wider public attention via the publication of his two key texts, the 1908 Racial Problems in Hungary, followed by the South Slav question and the Habsburg monarchy in 1911, his subsequent political activism and propaganda work during the First World War had rightfully earned him the status of a modern international liberal icon, akin to someone like William Gladstone or Woodrow Wilson. So just again, jump through a couple of key points here. This paralleled his pivotal role in the founding of the first Czechoslovak Republic as the secessionist leader Thomas Masaryk's wartime political facilitator, as well as an advisor to his pro-Yugoslavian counterparts, the Yugoslav Committee. Masaryk's former colleague Lev Sitrava and the Yugoslav poet Milan Churchin were no less reverential. In championing the rights of small nations, the peoples of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe owed this tireless, wandering Scot an eternal debt as a co-founder of post-Habsburg Europe's system of independent nation-state, embodying the spiritual current of Anglo-Saxon democracy. His achievements in academia and public relations were also commended, notably the opening of the School of Slavonic Studies at King's College, later to become today's UCL-SSEES School of Slavonic and East European Studies, in 1915, and the New Europe Foreign Politics magazine, published from 1916 to 1920. Dame Lillian Penson, who had served as the first ever female vice-chancellor at a British university, described him as having exemplified a new type of hybrid historian, capable of engaging in politics and public affairs, as well as academic scholarship. However, in the decades since his death, historical debate on Seton-Watson has largely hinged on his perceived influence over British policy towards Austria-Hungary. Writing in the early 60s, Arthur May and Harry Hannack, both viewed as eminent authorities on modern Central and Eastern Europe in their own right, framed the New Europe as crucial in turning what had previously been a virtual non-issue among the British political and diplomatic establishment, let alone general public, into an unexpectedly vigorous campaign to redraw Europe's political boundaries according to liberal principles of national self-determination. Despite running at a consistent loss, by 1918, the New Europe magazine held significant influence within Whitehall's foreign policy circles. Key to this was Seton-Watson's insistence on informing public opinion and his development of the New Europe Group, a loose network of expert and public figures affiliated to the magazine, who sought to lobby the Foreign Office. Unsurprisingly, Seton-Watson's prescribed role in the dual monarchy's downfall has made him a highly divisive figure. Much of this stems from post-colonialist critiques, notably Edward Said's seminal work, Orientalism, concerning cultural justifications for European imperialism. In Seton-Watson's case, the positive reaffirmation of his activism, espoused in The Making of a New Europe, published in 1981, which I have a copy of here, a biographical study authored by his sons Hugh and Christopher, emerged as the initial point of contention. Nicholas Miller, a historian of Yugoslavia, precipitated this historiographical turn by challenging the veracity of his expert status. Highlighting what he deemed as a shallow understanding of Serbia that came to politically dominate the first Yugoslavia, Miller dismissed Seton-Watson as a dilettante, eager to dabble in politics and diplomacy while lacking genuine knowledge of the subjects he addressed. Pre-war connections with his own journalistic credentials, carefully embellished with the affectations of a learned scholar, had enabled him to influence wartime policymaking while distorting a wider public perceptions through propaganda. This revisionist trend was accentuated by a historiographical backlash predicated mainly on Said's theories in response to the pejorative cultural stereotyping of Eastern Europe among Western politicians and media pundits during the Yugoslav Wars of Succession in the 1990s. Debate surrounding Seton-Watson, however, has mostly been framed by Maria Todorova's concept of Balkanism. In the absence of Western colonialism, Southeast Europe was construed as a space of insalubrious cultural liminality within the Western mind, separate from the Saïdian Orient, but occupying a similar Eastern milieu against which a self-congratulatory image of the European and the West has been constructed. Building on Miller, James Evans and Vesna Drapac's critiques on British involvement in the first Yugoslavia's creation situate Seton-Watson in a myopic web of Western strategic intrigues. His own attitudes have been labelled emblematic of an underlying Balkanist mentality that consigned the would-be Yugoslavs to a repressive Serb-dominated regime after 1918. These negative evaluations interrelate with revisionist assessments of Tomáš Masaryk and pre-socialist Czechoslovakia's democratic image, particularly in relation to how the Czechs treated their minorities. More recently, however, the Balkanist school has been subject to increasing degrees of scrutiny. Notable points of criticism include a tendency among its adherents to downplay regional agency, while presenting the Western image of Eastern Europe as one predicated on negative preconceptions. In Britain's case, this has prompted a shift away from identifying or extrapolating on patterns of cultural prejudice towards the influence of more contemporary domestic trends. Although Miller's original thesis retains some validity, it appears discernibly less robust when placed within the specific contexts and pragmatic realities of early 20th century Britain and British knowledge of this particular region. Indeed, while Seton-Watson was far from a comprehensive authority, his legacy nevertheless stands as one of the few points of historical access for scholars wishing to broaden their knowledge of Britain's perspective on Central Europe and the Western Balkans before 1914. This straitened approach is as much a reflection of the limited range of secondary literature as it is a testament to Seton-Watson's wide-ranging field expertise and, reputedly, impressive linguistic repertoire. Even Drapac's otherwise scathing assessment acknowledges him as the emerging British voice of the Yugoslav cause, allowing historians to gauge the popularity or otherwise of Britain's various and changing positions on the Yugoslav question. Now, before the First World War, Seton-Watson was actually one piece in a much broader and fairly loose coterie of politicised regional expertise, centred on something called the Balkan Committee. Founded by the radical MP Noel Buxton in 1903, it was dominated by liberal politicians with a distinctly pro-Bulgarian slant centred on the ensuing political crisis in Ottoman-ruled Macedonia, today's North Macedonia, that erupted in 1903. Despite differing ideological interpretations of liberalism, Buxton subsequently joined the Labour Party in 1919, those affiliated to the committee subscribed to some variation of the concept of liberal internationalism. This is a foreign policy doctrine originally articulated by Henry Temple, or the Viscount Palmerston, espousing the needs for liberal states to intervene in the affairs of other countries in pursuit of a liberal international order. And of course, that can involve things such as military intervention, humanitarian aid, promoting free trade. Obviously, in 1919, as you can see here, Woodrow Wilson was probably became the most high-profile advocate for this, particularly through his 14 points. And the problem is, of course, what this actually equated to in practice remains still a matter of debate, at least until I've undertaken more research in the archives. Seton-Watson's interpretation largely reflected that of his far more politically ensconced French counterparts, such as Louis Léger and Victor Béran, who viewed the cultivation of regional expertise as an extension of promoting French culture and influence in regions such as Central Europe and the Balkans. To this end, replicating a similar trend in Britain, whose commercial and cultural links with Southeastern Europe were even less substantial than France's, experts were required to reconfigure the tenets of liberal internationalism in a manner that would better resonate with contemporary public sentiments. However, I would still argue that ultimately this approach was set, that what ultimately informed this approach were a set of public discourses concerning alarmist projections of British imperial and domestic decline, Britain's lackluster performance in the Second Boer War, its ongoing economic stagnation since really around the 1880s, concerns over urban poverty, and a rising sense of disillusionment in the Victorian ideals of scientific and technological progress were being increasingly strewed around a more radical belief in Britain's need to renew itself through social reform at home and a reassertion of itself on the world stage. At the heart of this distinctive form of what I would term popular internationalism laid a shared belief in the need to inform and educate the wider public on foreign policy matters. Ultimately, so this theory went, it would generate a groundswell in popular opinion and grant lobby groups such as the Balkan Committee opportunities to vicariously exert influence over British foreign policy, as had happened in France during the 1890s. Informing and guiding public opinion itself was thus deemed the only effective means of gaining leverage over policymaking circles. And it's this point that I would argue Seton-Watson largely comes to guide Seton-Watson, especially during the First World War. As my recent book has also explored in the case of Yugoslavia, Seton-Watson's rise to prominence was as much, if not a reflection, of Britain's own changing domestic climate, specifically the realignment of traditional power structures as a result of urbanization, a growing public access to information in the latter half of the 19th century, and a coalescing of ideas about knowledge and knowledge generation and gaining access to knowledge via higher educational qualifications. By the turn of the century, information relating to areas such as Eastern Europe had become more accessible, but the ability to engage in any form of discourse was still confined to elite circles of mostly upper middle class personalities, what the political analyst William Wallace judicially labels as organized opinion. These in turn form part of an informed public, a segment of society concerned in concentrated in academia, journalism, politics, and publishing, keen to be active in the way Britain established its knowledge and contacts with the outside world. The emergence of a cadre of foreign policy expertise, of whom you can see a selection of here, was itself indicative of a broader trend across Western Europe. It would probably be expedient to describe the emergence of the so-called expert in Britain as being very much a continental import. In the case of Eastern and Central Europe, much of this was itself an echo of what had actually occurred in France, particularly during the mid-1800s. During this time, French and Polish émigré scholars were already promoting Slavonic studies as an academic discipline at institutions such as the Collège de France. Having claimed to have been the only Westerner present for the inauguration of Zagreb's Yugoslav Academy of Science and Arts in 1867, the author Louis Lergère argued that the Southern Slavs should even be viewed as an integral part of European civilization, owing to their early adoption of Christianity. Indeed, one of the most interesting aspects of Seton-Watson's early research, which I discovered when exploring the archives, is the fact that he initially relied on various French texts written between 1860 and 1902 when planning the first draft of his book Racial Problems in Hungary. Notable among the works used were those of the geographer Bertrand Urbach, who had himself courted controversy by stating that ethnicity and language weren't mutually inclusive, using Austria-Hungary's Italian and Slovenian subjects in the southwestern provinces as his primary case study. Given that nationalist territorial claims in the late 19th century were increasingly hinged on a Herderian understanding of national identity, language, and belonging, this was considered highly controversial within France, as well as further afield, and actually, I think, highlights the degree of nuance through which Seton-Watson approached the question of race and irredentism in this early period. As in France, the rise of alternative channels for public engagement and the evolution of the press as a forum for the free exchange of opinion had partially supplanted the government's own overseas representatives. Indeed, despite remaining a bastion of Britain's pre-Victorian aristocratic hegemony, by 1900, even the Foreign Office's upper echelon had acquiesced to the fact that individuals such as businessmen or newspaper correspondents or even independent travelers often represented far more reliable sources of local information than their own embassy and consular staff. Nowhere did this seem more pronounced than in the Habsburg monarchy, where Britain's diplomatic presence existed largely as a spillover from the wider Eastern question. Originating in the European powers' conflicting geostrategic ambitions surrounding the Ottoman Empire's ongoing decline, particularly in Britain and Russia, as early as the Greek War of Independence, London had sought to safeguard its interests by preserving the integrity of Istanbul's territorial holdings in the Balkans. While this included an often unfused acceptance of changing political contours, such as the recognition of Serbian, Romanian, and Montenegrin independence in 1878, maintaining Ottoman and Habsburg hegemony as a counterbalance to Russian imperial designs remained paramount in the minds of most British diplomats and government ministers. Consequently, outside of the main embassy in Vienna and a quasi-diplomatic post in Budapest, since Austria-Hungary's formal establishment in 1867, Britain's presence had been limited to a few monitoring posts on the Adriatic coast and a consulate in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, inherited from the Ottomans in 1878. No concerted efforts were made to broaden its scope until 1898, when a new mission was finally established in Prague. Unlike the other European powers and Turkey, however, coverage of the monarchy remained narrow. Reporting to the Foreign Secretary Edward Grey in September 1906, the Consul General in Budapest, F.S. Clark, alluded to Hungary's lowly position among London's diplomatic priorities, commenting only briefly on the paucity of British economic interests. Indeed, any value the Kingdom of the Magyars may have held in Whitehall before 1914 lay in its ascribed status as a fixture of the wider European balance of power, and the disproportionate level of political influence Hungary's aristocratic political class exerted over the dual monarchy's central government itself. Seton-Watson's intervention not only served towards resolving this foreign policy lacuna, but represented a direct challenge to the schematic romanticism that had underpinned the Western cultural image of Hungarian nationalism, even before the revolution of 1848. While a procession of wealthy travellers exposited on the virtuousness of Magyar culture and national character, various émigré intellectuals and visiting scions of the Hungarian elite reinforced uninformed impressions of an innate racial nobility. During the 1890s, the Hungarian-born journalist and founder of the Hungarian Society in London, Louis Felbermann, articulated this as a form of meta-narrative, indicative of the ideological nation-statism absent in Britain. Magyar rule over other races, such as the Slovaks, not only represented the outcome of centuries of historical circumstance, but a manifestation of an inherent cultural and intellectual superiority. That's a quote, if you're wondering. The rise of British organised opinion was equally reflective of the growing stratification of specialist knowledge into learned hierarchies that promoted a culture of intellectual contrarianism. This gradual monopolisation of representative channels was dependent on possessing the independent means for regional travel, excluding the majority of the public, and accentuating the fact that the new public interaction in foreign affairs remained a mostly middle-class phenomenon. Nevertheless, a key measure of these earlier experts' initial success was an ability to appeal to a much broader set of audiences than their 19th century predecessors. These seemingly novel approaches were also assisted by extensive political and press connections. Again, a key aspect of Seton-Watson's own success was the fact that he quickly became acquainted with Henry Wickham Steed down there in the bottom right, who would later go on to edit the Times' foreign affairs section during the First World War. The success of the Congo Reform Association's international media campaign against Leopold of Belgium's brutal colonial regime in the Congo Free State from 1903 to 1907 served as the principal model through which the Balkan Committee sought to achieve its objectives in Macedonia. The association's deliberate emphasis on the brutal exploitation of the native Congolese and appeals to a sense of civilizational morality ensured its success in encouraging reformist elements in the Belgian government to force the king into relinquishing his personal rule over the colony in 1908. As well as attempting to harness a latent sense of Turkophobic public outrage in relation to alleged atrocities against Macedonia's Christian Slavs, the committee also sought to construe these events as grounds for British intervention in the Ottoman Balkans as a humanitarian rather than political initiative. In contrast to his peers, however, Seton-Watson's interest in the Western Balkans was a relatively late development. Racial problems in Hungary, based on early impressions of Budapest's political treatment of non-Magyars, focused on alleged abuses against Slovaks and Romanians, while paying limited attention to the areas populated by Croats and Serbs, or even Czechs. Moreover, it is important to note that his definition of Southern Slavs mostly equated to Croats and Croatian Serbs, whose political and social elite dominated the monarchy's Yugoslav autonomous movement at the time. Other groups, such as Bosnian Muslims, and more so those outside of the monarchy, such as the Montenegrins, Macedonian Slavs, or Serbs hailing from Serbia proper, were largely absent from his later categorizing. As one reviewer complained in the journal Veda, while the Southern Slav question outlined extensive injustices against Croats and Serbs, the plight of the Slovenes, supposedly the third tribe of the historical Yugoslavian nation, was barely acknowledged. Correspondingly, his own vision of a potential Yugoslavian entity before 1914 paralleled those of his Croatian contacts as forming an autonomous unit within a reformed Habsburg monarchy. Like most liberal British pundits, much of this stemmed from an underlying aversion to Serbian nationalism, following the violent overthrow of the pro-Habsburg king Alexander Obrenović in June 1903. This presumption had been coloured by his first visit to Belgrade in May 1908, and the country's present regime, of which he dismissed as thoroughly corrupt and inefficient, worse even than the Hungarian. Though these impressions gradually changed, he remained mistrustful of Serbia's political establishment and the nationalist aspirations of its long-serving Prime Minister, Nikola Pasic. Confiding to his wife that the Great Serbian State had become inevitable with the outbreak of war in 1914, he qualified this often misquoted statement by claiming that, with the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, its realization now represented the only guarantee of a Southern Slav state that would ensure the protection of the Croatian parliament, the center of Yugoslav democracy, in Zagreb, from the threat of pan-Germanism and Magyarization. However, regardless of his numerous connections and recognized status as an authority on Central Europe, his success in piercing the Foreign Office's veil of aloofness was itself somewhat limited. In contrast to the highly emotive energy that had galvanized the Congo Reform Association, dubious associations with violence deprived the Balkans of a political cause célèbre. Moreover, developments after 1903 demonstrated the limits of its direct appeal and perceived inability to reach the wider public. A reliance on broadsheet newspapers and specialized periodicals for disseminating information limited any scope for developing more general interest, given that the more generally popular tabloid press tended to garnered greater attention with its focus on crime, sexual violence, sport, and gambling over politics, and it barely ever covered foreign affairs. By 1910, even the term expert had acquired pejorative connotations within the British Foreign Office's internal correspondence. Indeed, rather than seeking out their advice, those involved in formulating Britain's foreign policy were more likely to question an academic or journalist's putative right to pronounce opinions on international affairs. The apparent nebulous of what actually constituted an expert invariably brought substitute pejoratives such as crank, faddist, or even propagandist to the fore when discussion gravitated towards Balkan matters. This ascribed image was not entirely unfounded. The Balkan Committee was itself riven by its own members' ethno-national favoritisms, precipitating its splintering and protracted decline during and after the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913. Moreover, the academic nature of much of their work led to over-specialization in certain areas and profound ignorance, and often resorting to facile generalizations in others. Writing in 1914, for example, Seton-Watson argued that granting international recognition to the alien and barbarous Albanian tribes was absurd when civilized southern Slavs still languished under Austria-Hungary's increasingly authoritarian rule. Against this broader context, it's unsurprising that the period 1914 to 1920, in which overseas issues were suddenly elevated to the fore of public concerns, for obvious reasons, represented the apogee in Seton-Watson's promotion of these secessionist causes. In collaboration with Steed, recently appointed as the Times foreign editor, he successfully coordinated Britain's pro-Serbian wartime propaganda campaign, forging a narrative that dovetailed into calls for the formation of a post-war Yugoslav state. As secretary of the Serbian Relief Fund, his wartime efforts proved highly successful in appealing to humanitarian sentiment. Writing to the Czechoslovak leader, Masaryk, at the end of the war, he even boasted that the fund had raised well over £1 million from public donations alone. By 1916, this perceived struggle for Yugoslav freedom was enmeshed in broader narratives concerning the Triple Entente's prescribed moral duties to secure the rights of subject peoples in Central and Eastern Europe. The New European Journal, instituted in October 1916, became the platform for this envisioned movement, with the with Masaryk himself and his veneration of nationality and political self-determination serving as its underlying ideological linchpin. Of equal significance was the inauguration of the School of Slavonic Studies as a department of King's College in 1915, with Masaryk once again serving as spiritual founder of sorts. And it was itself envisioned as a centre for preparing future advisors to the Foreign Office. Despite only ever reaching a maximum circulation of 5,000, the New Europe also granted Seton-Watson the long-desired platform for influencing British foreign policy makers while disseminating the tenets of his liberal internationalist vision. Moreover, his position as de facto liaison for the anti-Habsburg Yugoslav Committee, as well as a sort of middleman for Masaryk, granted him a far greater degree of access to government ministers. During the Paris Peace Conference, where he unofficially served as an advisor to the Yugoslavian delegation, his expertise was called upon to assist in resolving the new South Slav state and Italy's emerging dispute over the ex-Habsburg territories in the Eastern Adriatic. These activities did not entirely meet with official appreciation, however. Exacerbation at the Foreign Office over the New Europe's continued efforts to promote an anti-Habsburg agenda even saw him drafted into the Royal Army Medical Corps as a private and promptly exiled to an officers' training camp in Blackpool for over a month. His political work in achieving a post-war agreement between the Southern Slavs was itself belied by continued disagreements between the Yugoslav Committee and Serbian government in exile over how the new country would be governed. Having himself backed a proposal for a federal structure, Seton-Watson privately voiced his own disquiet over Belgrade's machinations and Pasic's portentous presence at the peace conference. Although later serving in the Foreign Office's intelligence department from 1939 to 42, the New Europe's folding in 1920 effectively marks the end of Seton-Watson's political activities. Domestically, the war's aftermath had largely removed most of the discursive mechanisms on which organised and informed opinion had previously relied upon in order to maintain their presence in the public sphere. Experts now struggled to simply to present their views as the number of discursive platforms, including the New Europe, went into decline. Writing to Steed in 1920, Seton-Watson even admitted that the journal's impending liquidation was the logical outcome of deadened public opinion. Without some form of popular interest to build upon, as had been the case before the war, private individuals would, he predicted, be less and less likely to embark unaided upon such a venture as the New Europe. Even the School of Slavonic Studies, his other great passion project, proved equally unsuccessful in achieving his initial goal of replicating French success in creating a dedicated cadre of foreign policy experts in the mould of himself. Indeed, not even its nominal purpose of expanding the presence of East European languages in British higher education was actually ever realised until around the late 50s and early 60s. So I think I'll leave it there for now. As I said, I don't really want to offer any conclusions. This is still a work in progress, but I am, of course, very happy to address any issues you may have, any questions, or even your own hypotheses. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for that really thought-provoking talk. I think I saw the clapping, the hands icon appearing, and I can't find it at the moment, but I'd also like to give you a round of applause. Yeah, for I think a work in progress, this is shaping up very impressively and promisingly. So now we have over 45 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So I would invite everybody who has a question or comment to please raise your hand, and I'll call on you in the order in which these hands are raised. And again, if your connection is not strong enough, or if you prefer not to ask the question on Zoom, you're welcome also to type a question in the chat. Well, I see one hand already up. Lucia Balikic, please.
Hello, and I'm happy to break the ice. Congratulations, Sam. This is a really interesting presentation, and I'm really glad that you're dealing with this topic. So I would have two questions and maybe one suggestion or an idea for you. The first question would be, did you find anything regarding the connections between the New Europe group and the American intellectuals doing kind of a similar thing? This is something that I've been wondering for a long time. So if you know anything, especially about the connection between Seton-Watson and people from the Wilson administration, I would be really interested if you came across something regarding that. Second question would be something also that I've been thinking about for a long time, is that where do you see the analogies between how Seton-Watson describes Austro-Hungarian empire's basic problems, issues, and so on, and also those of the British Empire? Because there is, for example, one article, I think it's quite an old article, about a considerable overlap between the New Europe Society and the adjacent societies, like Serbian Society of Great Britain and so on, and the Round Table Society, which is kind of relevant in this period. So I want to know if you came across those connections, or just in his intellectual thought, if you saw analogies in this regard. And my suggestion for you would be to, when he is talking about Yugoslavia, right, and when he's trying to, you mentioned actually a few times in your presentation, his kind of relationship to Serbian nationalism, to greater Serbian idea, and so on. And in this context, what I always felt reading all of his work was rather that he had this kind of typical imperial civilizational argument that Croats are somehow higher on this civilizational hierarchy and Serbs are somehow lower, or Ottoman, despotic, like that their ethnic belonging is somehow related to their inability to achieve political modernity. So my suggestion would be that this is maybe the key to unlock this relationship of his to Serbian nationalism, that it has a bit to do with this kind of imperial civilizational hierarchies. Yeah, hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Sam, would you like to respond to the questions and comment?
Certainly. Thank you very much for your questions, Lucia. Yes, starting off with the connections between the New Europe group and various lobbying organizations in the States. I'm certain those existed before, at least before 1918 or 1919. However, as I say, I am still at the beginning of the research process, so I've still to come across them. A thing I did have noticed, actually, it's quite interesting, is that Seton-Watson, again, for all his sort of internationalist bona fides, he's never actually comes across as that interested in the United States. It's quite uncanny, certainly compared to his Yugoslav and Czechoslovak colleagues. It's I do get the impression, again, his focus is very much on Britain and France as sort of the supposedly leading lights in this new internationalist order. Obviously, that does start to change at the Paris Peace Conference to an extent, particularly when Wilson starts to assume a far more senior role. Analogies between Austria-Hungary and the British Empire, invariably those occur. I think one of the key points, and this is why I tend to focus a lot on Britain's domestic context, particularly in the book, and no doubt I'll be building on that with this new project, is the fact that at this point in time, I mean, nowadays, it's the sort of the mindset behind so much of this, again, is very different. Again, many people might say imperialist, although I don't necessarily think that's always a satisfactory way of explaining it. But the key point of reference even most of these sort of, internationally minded experts have is ultimately Britain and British society. It's the same thing I would say in France, but to a slightly different degree, a different extent, which is what a different angle, which is why I would say it's probably I would say it's much more. I think it's actually far more useful to compare British expertise to French expertise rather than American, I would say, and actually think of France as always kind of the leading authority in this area. So again, yes, there is a lot of contrast, but I actually feel though it does tend to be quite superficial in places. And also for the fact that it's also quite reactionary. It tends, if you actually look at a lot of stuff, a lot of what they're discussing in terms of issues in the British Empire, a lot of it focuses invariably on Ireland. In fact, most of it focuses on Ireland. That's certainly when Seton-Watson discusses it. Ireland is his key frame of reference. So again, obviously the imperialist mindset's there, but you always need to take into account it's quite anchored in the specific context rather than kind of looking back to say the earlier stages of British imperialism, if you like. And again, yeah, your suggestion, obviously, the British are almost the British are almost the lead, almost have the lead in sort of in being able to create hierarchies out of everything. Certainly, when Seton-Watson's talking about Yugoslavia, what he means Yugoslavia, as maybe I tried to convey in kind of one of my slides, he basically means what becomes Croatia, and specifically Dalmatia, incidentally. Most of his contacts, such as Ante Trombrich and the coalition party that comes to prominence. So a lot of that, and I think again, you also need to bear in mind that a lot of what he's sort of saying is mostly just him reflecting what kind of the influence he's picked up. This is another thing a lot of people tend to presume. They tend to assume that the sort of the British and many Western experts are just reflecting innate prejudices and a belief in Western superiority. They are to an extent, but they're also absorbing almost via osmosis these sort of nationalist discourses, and in this case what he's articulating is a very Dalmatian centric idea of Yugoslavia, if you like. Okay,
great. I don't see any hands up at the moment, but there are several questions in the chat, and maybe I could just read them to you, and you take them all, and then we go to another round. So first of all, from Boyan Alexov, he asks, could you please specify Nicholas Miller's criticism? Why did he term Seton-Watson a dilettante? And Marek Swomka sent a question directly to me, but he also has his hand up. Maybe it's the same question, so I'll just read the other question I have in the chat here, which is from Emma Hatto, who asks, could you please expand on how Seton-Watson perceived the Slovenes as a national group? To what extent was he aware of Slovene attitudes towards the concept of a South Slav state versus loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy in this period? And how did this fit into his own perspective? So maybe you could address those two questions, and then we'll go to Marek.
Of course, thank you very much for both of those questions, Bojan and Emma. So in terms of Nicholas Miller's dilettante comment, so when that article came out, it was the 1980s. This was a period in which, again, the unrest with it, there was of course growing unrest within the Socialist Yugoslavian Federation. You of course have the rise of Milosevic at this time. And my inkling, and it's just an inkling, was that this was kind of Miller was sort of in some way reacting against that. Figures such as Seton-Watson were often held up, particularly by Serbian nationalists, as some kind of justification for their claims, or sort of as some sort of historic precedents to sort of justify support for their movement. And I get and again, this is only my inkling, but I get the suspicion that Miller was sort of, again, reacting against that. And also he was very much thinking in a sort of Saidian mindset, the idea of Seton-Watson as this Western imperialist type figure who, and particularly in and again, this is very prevalent in the British case, as I'm sure most of you are aware, the assumption that as the world's leading imperial power at the time, Britons have some kind of innate right to go around the world and comment and pass judgment on other regions. So that I would suspect, I think that's where Miller's coming from. Again, the article's certainly very well researched, but I personally don't really I disagree with its conclusions. I personally think Seton-Watson had a far more nuanced understanding to sort of, and was far more aware of the various pitfalls and sort of difficulties within these various nationalist movements. For your question, Emma, on the Slovenes, that sort of dovetails a little bit into Lucia's earlier comments, and the fact that really when Seton-Watson, and again, this is a case as well of Czechoslovakia, if you like, when Seton-Watson talks about these sort of multi-ethnic polities that emerge after the First World War, what he's not necessarily espousing a kind of universal truth about them. He's really espousing a particular perspective, and that's usually the perspective he was originally handed by or sort of absorbed from his contacts. So in the case of Yugoslavia as well, this is a perspective of Yugoslavia that's very much focused on the Croatian inhabited parts of the West, or Croatian and Serb inhabited areas. It's very much centered, I would say, more so on Dalmatia, which has kind of emerged as a center for Yugoslav secessionism before the First World War, and it espouses a very Croatian and Serbo-Croatian, if you like, centric perspective on what Yugoslavia ought to be. And the Slovenes themselves, I mean, for one thing, he doesn't really have that many Slovene contacts anyway when he's undertaking his work, his sort of political activism. And the Slovenes don't really feature in that. They are quite self-contained. The majority of the Slovenian intellectual establishment Britain itself doesn't really feature on their radar most of the time. It's mostly focused on France. This is a kind of legacy of the Napoleonic era, where there was a small autonomous, I won't say Slovenian state, but a sort of autonomous Slovene territory did exist, or semi-autonomous Slovene territory was created by the French Empire in this region. So there is a presumption even amongst the Slovenes that it'll be the French who will, or Slovene secessionists, that it will be the French who will win them their freedom, their liberty, so to speak.
Thank you, Marek. would you like to ask a question?
Yes, good evening. Yes, and thank you for the talk. Forgive me as a layperson if I were to divide up the history of the South Slav peoples into three post-Second World War phases, namely the Tito era, the 1990s wars, and their immediate aftermath, and third, right through to the present day. How has all this scholarly work of Seton-Watson, the New Europe Group, etc., and others, how has it actually been perceived in the various territories of Yugoslavia? How has it evolved through that time frame which I described, right down to the present day when Britain was, say, post-wars, still was hanging on to its imperial vestiges, post-Second World War, of course, right down to the present day when it is no longer part of the EU? I wonder if you could comment on that from the point of view of how academics in the succession countries look at this theme, and indeed how it touches on evolving political attitudes in those states.
Do you want me to respond now? Yeah. Thank you very much for your question, Thomas. It's a little bit difficult to suggest because you can't really limit Seton-Watson to only the South Slavic Balkans. His influence very much, he's in some respects, he's often talked about almost more in Hungary and the Czechia and the Slovak republics in certain respects these nowadays. Obviously, in Czechia and the Slovak Republic, he tends to be presented in this very, well, obviously this very positive light. Certainly, I would say certainly more so than in the South Slavic Balkans, which is quite interesting. Possibly due to the ongoing popularity of Masaryk in that regard. When you look at him through history, again, one of the issues you have is there's this, from 1945 really up to about the 1980s, there's pretty much a black hole regarding him, mainly due is due to the socialist period. Again, I don't think this is particularly unusual for many of these. When you kind of think about when you think about this type of scholarship and the sort of the politics of the Cold War. Now it's become a little bit. I mean, it's still quite sporadic. He tends to be. Again, a lot of the research doesn't really necessarily focus on him the way I'm doing. A lot of it I mean, obviously you have. Petar Lajlo's article, which I referenced earlier on I referenced earlier on the talk, but most of it tends to kind of feature him more again as a sort of point of entry into the wider into sort of understanding British relations with the region. Today, it's quite difficult to it's still quite difficult to say. I mean. I would possibly, I mean, the fact it's not actually, he doesn't seem to crop up nearly as much as he used to, could itself be almost, you know, metonymic for Britain's perceived declining place as a presence within Europe. I mean, again, I don't really necessarily like to try and link everything to contemporary political discussions myself, but I think again, a lot of his value still is mostly in many respects more practical than actual theoretical or historical or knowledge based. Again, the fact that he has one of the most you know, he left one of the most comprehensive archives, maybe not so much on Czechoslovakia, but certainly on early Yugoslavia, not just in English but also in French, German, Czech, Slovak, South Slavic. I think really that's really kind of one of the core reasons as to how he's been able to maintain his presence, really. Sorry if that wasn't a very satisfying response, but it's again, it's always quite difficult to judge, particularly when your research is still ongoing.
Sure, no, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Tom Lorman, you have a question.
Thanks. Actually, I have two quick questions. which perhaps also are somewhat linked to comments as well. The first one is about Seton-Watson's contacts. It seems to me that he had a number of contacts who he listened to and absorbed from, but he also had a number of contacts who he argued with and dismissed. I'm thinking particularly of the leading Hungarian intellectuals that he met before the First World War, who he certainly had lengthy conversations with, but found to be unpersuasive in their own assessments of the situation. Do you have a sense of why he found some contacts persuasive and others not? His sons claim that it's because the Hungarians were telling him lies, whereas the non-Hungarians were telling him the truth. But I wonder if it's more subtle than that, in that some sense he met figures in Hungary who were in positions of authority, whereas was there something of the rebellious streak in him where he preferred the underdog? And building on that, Seton-Watson also seems to me to be someone who relished an argument. In fact, he was engaged in ferocious arguments from at least 1906 publicly through the press with his various critics, and it went on all the way through. Is that part of the story of the man, that actually he relished a fight and saw within Central and Eastern Europe a forum and an opportunity to engage in intellectual battles, and that almost it was the battle itself that he relished as much as the actual position he took? Thanks, and thank you for a wonderful presentation as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for all these excellent questions. On your first point about contacts, I would say I think your theory is actually probably fairly accurate. Again, I don't want to second guess someone who's been dead for over 70 years, but so yeah, one of the things that make Seton-Watson quite unique, particularly amongst his peers, is that he's very good at contextualizing things. Again, bear in mind, he's among these sort of individuals in Britain, he's one of the few who actually, not many of them actually have academic historical training of any kind. He's quite unusual in that respect. Most of them are journalists who tend to be quite reactive, or anthropologists. Again, anthropology at the time is quite an amateur pursuit. Certainly more so, it becomes more professionalized during the interwar period, but at the time it's still viewed as a quite accessible thing that rich, bored people who can afford to travel can engage in. So Seton-Watson himself is, I would say, a lot more professionalized, more of a professional academic when that's how he approaches a lot of these discussions. And also the fact that he has quite a good grasp of language as well. So I would say where his dismissal of the Hungarians, again, it probably comes from the fact that many of those he's he conducts many of these interviews having first of all done his own field work, for one thing. So hence he's already he's been able to build up a kind of basis of evidence with which to sort of fire back at people, fire back at kind of the dominant narrative, if you like. And again, whilst also being aware of the power imbalance between Hungarians, Slovaks, and Romanians in the Hungarian portion of the Habsburg monarchy. So I think that's really the crux of why he dismisses the Hungarians. Again, he is liberal internationalist. He has somewhat imperialistic leanings, but it's a very soft liberal British imperialism whereby things are done more through compromise or sort of benign forms of persuasion, of coercion, if you like. Whereas in Hungary, what he sees as something he attributes more to, say, what's happening in Russia, something that's being done through force, aggressive nationalism, and I think that's really, again, he's far from sort of objective in his assessments. He sort of more or less carries his prejudice against the Hungarians throughout the rest of his career. So again, that's certainly very much in place during the Paris Peace Conference as well. And would you say, was he naturally combative? I would say yes, to a degree. Yeah, he's certainly combative in an intellectual sense. During the interwar period, for example, he has a very high profile and, to most observers, very amusing battle with the anthropologist Edith Durham, who's often viewed as a sort of great champion of the Albanians. And they have this kind of highly sort of publicized battle through the interwar period. Obviously, before the First World War, he's having all these arguments with people in the press. But it's quite sort of, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of second guess why or psychoanalyze him too much, but I get the impression a lot of that stems from the fact that he's quite in person, he tends to be quite, what's the word? Reticent, really. So I would often wonder whether he's trying to compensate for that through sort of these academic arguments. It's also kind of indicative of when the School of Slavonic Studies is being set up. Seton-Watson, even by sort of his close friends, he's not deemed to be a very good administrator. And not a particularly good lecturer or teacher. So I think yeah, you are quite. I think you're probably quite accurate in that regard.
Thank you. Well, thinking about Tom's comment of whether he was attracted to the underdog. I mean, I wonder also how much he kind of his identity as a Scot played a role in his attitude towards the oppressed nations of Austria-Hungary, something that we talked about a little bit over lunch recently. You also mentioned your revelations about Seton-Watson as a poor administrator and lecturer, which is bursts our bubble here at SSEES. We're all trying to live up to the model of Seton-Watson. Well, maybe we are, without realizing it.
It's there on record. That's what his friends were saying. So.
Right. Well, there's a couple interesting questions in the chat that I'd like to bring up now. One is from Yevhen Yashchuk, who writes, my question is related to the phenomenon of the Eastern question, to which Seton-Watson paid much attention in his works in the 1920s and later. Did this question somehow appear in his earlier accounts about Yugoslavs or maybe even Czechoslovaks? Did Seton-Watson refer to the Eastern question when he described the contemporary South Slavic Balkans? And if so, what was his perspective on this question? So that's one question. Then there's two questions here from Richard Hamilton, who asks, do you think Seton-Watson's views on South Slav unity come across as naive in light of what happened in the 1990s? And second, did Seton-Watson have any significant influence in practice on British foreign policy towards the Western Balkans?
Sorry, just noting down those down. So turning to his perspective first on the Eastern question, to the degree that he does have some kind of perspective, it's always being tempered more by again, his general limited knowledge. Among his peers, again, Seton-Watson is fairly unique in that most of his focus is on the areas to the north, specifically the Habsburg monarchy, and those more northern territories, which, whilst far from untouched by Ottoman influences, are considered they were historically considerably less so, given the length of time they were occupied by the Ottoman Empire. I would say his sort of interest in the Eastern question is more related to just generally wider European politics than the actual regional issues affecting this area. Obviously, he tends to use there's a lot of, particularly when it comes to Serbian nationalism and the Serbs, that's probably kind of where it's become most apparent. More so, I would say, even more so with the Montenegrins, incidentally. He actually, when he's in one of his arguments with a Croat contact who was discussing seceding from Austria-Hungary in 1908 and union with Serbia and Montenegro, he actually says, no, don't do that. Or to sort of paraphrase him, he says, no, don't do that. Montenegro is trying to push all the rest of Europe into war, which is quite an interesting perspective, I thought. Montenegro rather than Serbia. So it's more, I would say his interest in the Eastern question is more the fact that it's such a sort of it's pretty much what determines a lot of the background ambience to this region in general. I mean, arguably the most important part of the world in the 1910s is still the former Ottoman Empire, by the fact that that's where so many of sort of the great powers' interests converge, really. In terms of Czechoslovakia, I would say probably not so much, albeit it does kind of, again, other than it gives him sort of something to compare and contrast Czechoslovakia to. I mean, one of the reasons why he's so infused by Czechoslovakia, particularly the Slovaks, incidentally. Most of these experts tend to have their own favored ethnic group, or sort of pet people, as Rebecca West later describes them, in the region. And with Seton-Watson, it's predominantly the Slovaks, probably because they were the first sort of group he properly studied and conducted interviews with for his field work back at when he was writing Racial Problems in Hungary. So yeah, I'd say it's the Eastern question is obviously there, but it's not necessarily it doesn't loom quite so large in his work as it does for someone like, say, Noel Buxton or H.M. Brailsford. Was he naive in light of what happened in the 1990s? Well, yes, I would say he certainly was, but again, that is sort of projecting, 80 years into the future. I don't really think I'm not sure it's necessarily fair to use what happened in the 1990s as the basis of a critique, for critique. Obviously, you can use it to identify flaws in, say, Western thinking or general Western arrogance, but really kind of using it, but assuming that he sort of didn't, but assuming that kind of, his support for Yugoslavia was somehow going to lead to disaster. And I mean, it's also important to point out as well, when Yugoslavia was created, there was actual, in the 1920s, there was actual enthusiasm for it. This wasn't some sort of deemed some sort of dark day in the history of the region, as is often characterized now. There was a degree of support for this, at least amongst kind of the political elites. I can't really speak for the general populace, but amongst political elites. And again, for someone like Seton-Watson, and particularly in the time he was in, that was really his sort of his means of gauging the future were very, very limited. again, even his own knowledge of this region, as extensive as it was very patchy, particularly kind of from the perspective he approached it from. Now, there was a second part to your question, but I'm not entirely sure what it was. Sorry, was
about whether Seton-Watson had significant influence on
Yeah.
British foreign policy towards the Western Balkans.
Yeah. He certainly had influence, but a lot of it stemmed more by the position, his, I would argue a lot of it stems more from his place as a facilitator for other groups, if you like, specifically, well, Masaryk and the Czechoslovak movement and the Yugoslav Committee. That does actually, in the case of Yugoslavia and the Balkans, that actually does start to wane, particularly after 1917, or even towards the end of 1916, where the Ante Trombric and the other senior Yugoslav secessionists actually start to lose patience with the British and the French, mainly because they're still dragging their heels over the partition of Austria-Hungary. And they kind of they start to not necessarily perceive, but kind of start to assume that Seton-Watson's efforts aren't really bearing fruit the way they want them to. This is why, again, they start to throw their weight so enthusiastically behind Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points. In terms of, I would also say his influence, and a lot, again, in terms of his influence, a lot of it stems from the fact that he, in many respects, is still being called upon to explain or disseminate historical knowledge on the region. Again, unless you're already versed in the language, the actual kind of complexities and vagaries and narratives of this area's history, they're not unknown, but they're still very, very obscure. Particularly in the case of the British political establishment, which in foreign policy terms is still very much a closed shop. It's dominated mostly by aristocrats, usually the second or third sons of aristocratic families. And it tends to be very insular and actually very mistrustful about external expertise. When his expertise is called upon, it's always done so very begrudgingly. So it's not so, again, I think Mark Cornwall's work, 2000 work, The Undermining of Austria-Hungary is a very important, I would say that's actually a very important type text to go through, because he actually points out one of the key elements behind, one of the key reasons, again, why these type names like Seton-Watson do also tend to loom quite large in a lot of these historical narratives is the fact that they themselves tended to do a lot of self-promotion. Surprise, surprise, and also try to kind of mythologize themselves as protagonists, particularly during the First World War.
Thank you. Well, I mean, you kind of answered a little bit a question that I had, which was about sort of why Seton-Watson wasn't included in the British delegation to Versailles, but someone like Louis Namur was, who was also a historian and not a British aristocrat. Was Seton-Watson viewed as too partial? But then on the other hand, I mean, maybe the British at Versailles tried to keep up appearances of impartiality better than others. I mean, the clearly pro-Czechoslovak historian Kerner, Robert Kerner, was part of the American delegation, I believe, and I mean, it's kind of a curious omission that Seton-Watson, who was obviously known to so many people, was not part of it. And then the other question I had was about this project in general. Where do you see it going, and what exactly are you what are you hoping to find in the SSEES archives at the moment? Maybe you could give us, as we near the end of our session, maybe you could give us a little bit of a preview of where you see this project going, how you see it taking shape in future.
Yeah. Just first of all, sort of finishing up with the reason why he was excluded from the British delegation. I can't say for sure, but one of the possible reasons may be that, in contrast to Namia particularly, obviously Namia was involved in a lot of wartime propaganda work, but I would say Seton-Watson was deemed to some degree he was deemed to be almost a bit too compromised based on his wartime activities. He had of course worked in the propaganda in the propaganda bureau with Steed towards the end of the war under Lord Northcliffe, and also he had sort of he had all these multiple contacts in the region, and particularly given the fact that he then served as a sort of informal advisor for the Yugoslav committee, I would suspect that had something to do with it, and the fact that he was editing, he edited this journal. It's actually quite noticeable that during the Second World War, one of the reasons where Seton-Watson does hold an intelligence post for the first half of the war, he later resigns primarily because he's barred from having any interaction with the press or being allowed to publish or have any contact with the press. I have the suspicion that trend you see in the Second World War is starting to creep in towards the end of the First World War as well. So again, it's only speculation, but that's, if I had to guess, I would say that's probably why he's barred from the British delegation. The fact again that he's too oriented towards the press, so to speak. For the project itself and where I hope to take it, well, as I say, it's still relatively early days. I'm hoping to look more at material focusing on the Czechoslovakian aspect of things. That's really what I'm hoping to uncover in the archives. I've actually started going through one of the files that deals with Czechoslovakia. It's a very well organized archive, although you do sometimes come, again, like with many archives, you do sometimes come across files that seem to be completely out of place. So that's sort of where I'm hoping to look at the moment. Obviously, I'll give you a report towards the end of my tenure. What I'm hoping to take this itself, my ambition is to turn this into a journal article. That's my ultimate ambition. I don't necessarily think there may be quite as much mileage for a second book, although we'll have to wait and see. But I would say, yeah, in the immediate sort of short to mid-term, that would be a journal article. Don't ask me which journal yet. I'm still considering my options, but that's kind of the goal. That's kind of the intended output, so to speak.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Are there any final questions or comments? We have about 5 minutes left. Yes, Agnes Beretsky.
Hello, everyone. I would like to get back to Thomas Lohrmann's comment. I may start my video. Yeah, that's possible. Hello, welcome. I also had the chance to study Seton-Watson's papers, and I think the reason why he was so critical about these Hungarian politicians he met one of the reasons was that he met the worst type of politicians or the first set of politicians, because his arrival to Budapest 1906, it was in April, I think, coincided with the coalition government. And he met all those people there. And the other problem was that the attitude of the Hungarian press, which instead of reading his books and his comments and his very scholarly ideas, they were attacking him as a person. And that was something he couldn't tolerate. And it was exactly the same thing was happening to Henrik M. Steed as well, whose papers I also had the chance to sort of study. So it is interesting to see Hungarian press cherry picking his ideas, taking them out of context, and very much criticizing him as a person, blackmailing even. So that was a serious problem. I probably have a question to you, what you think about whether you had the chance to study and C.A. McCartney, Caroline McCartney, who was a fellow historian, a bit younger, a student of Seton-Watson. And he once described his tutor as an upright, conscientious Puritan who knew everything and understood very little, which is a very harsh, seemingly harsh piece of criticism. And he meant that Seton-Watson didn't fully comprehend the phenomenon of assimilation, that there was voluntary assimilation and forceful assimilation. And I wonder what you think about this piece of criticism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Agnes. Yes, yeah, I mean, in going back to your sort of to your point on the reactions from the Hungarian press, many of these sort of things we tend to assume, or sort of the things we sort of often assume, we often sort of assume this period to be one that's quite reserved and overly polite. Most of these sort of populist attacks on people are not a recent phenomenon. They very much existed back in that time period, particularly in somewhere like Hungary, where where again, as you say, Seton-Watson was. And again, this was not a new thing. This is most of these sort of British Westerners tended to base much of their understanding on a culture from the people, from whatever tranche of the elite they were presented with. In which case, he unfortunately picked the worst kind. Again, most of them, I assume, were also probably aristocrats. In going back in regards to Caroline McCartney, I haven't had an opportunity yet. I am actually hoping to take a look, to have a look through her work at some later on. A lot of what I'm looking at is quite historically consigned, though, so I don't really want to kind of go too far forward, so to speak. I would, however, say in terms of ideas such as assimilation, it's important to remember, particularly at this period, in this very early period he's working in, it's that things like assimilation, a lot of these quite complex political, sociological and political science-based ideas, they're not really they're not very well developed or understood. This is the problem. They tend to kind of develop a lot more after the First World War, and this extends to things such as human rights. I mean, even during the First World War, even one of the key question, or one of the key aspects of the debate was of debates, particularly when it starts to emerge that various atrocities are being committed, was should civilian populations be protected? So again, it's always important to remember that Seton-Watson's still operating in a sort of legal, political, and even ethical framework that's not entirely different, but still quite significantly different to the one we live in, today, particularly in this post-Holocaust world we live in. So yeah, so thanks very much for the point, though.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, Tom, but I see your hand up. Do you have a quick question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to just follow up very quickly on Agnes's point, which is that actually there's a very interesting contrast with the so-called 80 Club of liberal internationalist MPs who visited Hungary in 1906 and wrote a glowing account of their experiences meeting very similar people to Seton-Watson. And so I think there's really this, it's very much about his relationship with the particular people he met. And it's just interesting. I just recommend having a look at the 80 Club published report of their visit to Budapest as a contrast that reveals, I think, that it's much more about personality rather than ideology in shaping the personality clashes, rather than ideology in shaping his attitude towards Hungary.
I also wouldn't be surprised if there's a slight class element in that, because a large number of the people in the 80 Club were from aristocratic families, incidentally. So you always, when it comes to Britain, you always have to think about class relations, even between the upper middle and upper class, so to speak. That's another perspective you always have to be aware of. Yeah.
Agnes, final thought?
Yeah, one very quick comment. In 1906, Seton-Watson's arrival to Budapest also coincided with the liberal landslide in Britain. And there was the incredible discrepancy between the low franchise Hungary and the more and more democratic Britain. And that was also an important background piece of information. Thanks very much, Thomas. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, the liberal landslide also brought in this idea, also incidentally brought in a much greater focus on the domestic context when you see kind of issues about domestic reform. So again, that would also be colouring much of his perspective when he arrives. So yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your questions, both of you.
Yes, thank you all. And thank you especially to our speaker this evening, Sam Foster. Please join me in giving him a round of applause.